If we try to run the application right now, we'll get an error. The application is going to complain that we don't have a data source configuration because we have the MySQL dependency. It's going to try to find some configuration in the property file, some configuration to some data source, and we don't have this configuration yet. So we're not going to run it yet because I know it's going to fail. So let's go ahead and put in that configuration so that we can connect to the database that we have, the MySQL database, hopefully that you also have. So let's go back to the application and we're gonna go to resource and this application.property. Now I'm gonna change this application.properties to a YAML file instead of a .properties file because that properties file is very repetitive. So for instance, if I were to specify the username and password, for instance, right, I would have to do something like this. So Spring dot data source dot URL, right, just to specify the URL, right? So I would have some URL here, like some URL. If I were to now specify the username, I would have to type in the same thing again. So I would do Spring data source and then password, right? So you can see how I keep repeating myself every time for every line. And if I had like 5 different properties I had to set, I would have to type in this whole Spring.data source every time. So that's I mean, you can use it if you want, but once you start having like a lot of lines of code in your actual properties file, and you're gonna see how it's gonna be very tedious to be typing everything over and over again. So that's why I'm gonna convert this file into a YAML file, and we don't have to repeat ourselves many times. So I'm gonna right click on this and I'm gonna go to refactor and then rename. I'm gonna give it the same name. The only thing I'm gonna change is the extension, so that's YML, so that turns it into a YAML file. Okay, so let's specify a different port number. So I like to do server and then colon, not address, that's gonna be 8081, and I want the port, so not the actual address. So server port, you can see I have completion as well. So server.port would be for the properties file, but here you just put a colon and then you go to the next line with a tabulation and you put the port number. And you can see how this is useful in a minute. So for the Spring data source, we're gonna do Spring.data source, not Spring.data source. So we're gonna do colon, oops, and here it's gonna be data source. Okay, and then here we're gonna specify the actual URL for the data source. So URL. So for ours, I'm using a MySQL database, so that's gonna be JDBC and MySQL SQL, and that's gonna be colon // and the actual URL, which is on my computer on port 3306. And now I have to specify the name of the actual database, and in my case it's support portal. Now I can specify the password, so I can do password, and you can see how I'm not repeating myself. So for the password, my password is let me in, and I think my username, I don't know why I keep doing that, is root. I'm using the root username. That's not recommended though if you're going into production or anything like that. And that should be everything that we need, but I like to specify some other JPA properties. So let's do Spring JPA. So now you can see how everything underneath this data source belongs to this. So we would go Spring data source and then URL, Spring data source password, because they all belong under the same data source. But now I want to do Spring JPA, so you can see how I'm back to the data source line, as you can see. So I can do JPA, and then now I can continue with other JPA. So under JPA I can do, let's do show SQL, because I want to show the actual SQL queries that are being fired. So I'm going to set this to true, and then I want to specify how the database is going to be created. That's the DDL, I think it's called the data definition. So let's do Hibernate, and I want to do DDL dash auto, and this is gonna be set to update. Well, actually we don't have the database yet, so let's do create. So once we fire the application, it's gonna read this and it's gonna create, it's gonna assume that the database is not there yet, and it's gonna create it. Not the database, the tables. So once this is to create, it's gonna create them. If they're already created, it's gonna drop them, which is delete them, and then create them again. So I wanted to create the first time, so I'm gonna set this to create. So, and I also have to specify some the dialect. So let's do GPA Hibernate and then dialect. So properties, and then here, oops, I have to specify Hibernate, and then I can do the dialect. This is very important. So that's going to be org.hibernate.dialect dot, and I have MySQL 8, so MySQL 8 dialect. Okay, so I think this is all we need for now, just so we can get started. Everything looks good. So if you don't know YAML or anything about YAML, I would definitely suggest that you do a little bit of research, but it's the same thing, just a different format, so that you don't keep repeating yourself, different from the .properties file, but they're technically doing the same thing.